He ran one of the most feared crime families on the eastern seaboard. He had judges in his pocket, politicians at his dinner table, and rivals buried in concrete beneath highway overpasses. Dominic Ferrara had never once flinched in the face of danger. But on a Tuesday afternoon, inside a quiet Italian restaurant in South Philadelphia, a waitress with ink-stained fingers and a paper coffee cup reached into her apron and pulled out something that brought the most powerful man in 3 states to his knees. What she knew about his son had been buried for 11 years, and it was going to destroy everything. The Ferrara estate sat on 14 acres outside of Chester County, Pennsylvania, a place where old money mingled with blood money, and the gardens were tended by men who never quite looked you in the eye. Iron gates, security cameras positioned at intervals a military general would approve of, and a staff of 12 who had all signed non-disclosure agreements drafted by a law firm that officially didn't exist. Inside this fortress, on the morning of October 3rd, 11-year-old Leo Ferrara sat at the long mahogany breakfast table and drew pictures of birds. He drew them in extraordinary detail. The arch of a wing mid-flight, the particular way a sparrow puffs its chest against the cold, the hollow expression of a hawk watching prey it hasn't yet decided to kill. His sketchbooks filled bookshelves. His tutors, 3 of them, each sworn to discretion, said he was the most gifted student they'd ever instructed. His reading comprehension tested at a college sophomore level. His mathematics were flawless. His memory was, by every professional account they were permitted to give, extraordinary. Leo Ferrara had never heard a single sound in his 11 years of life. He was born profoundly deaf, bilateral sensorineural hearing loss, the kind that sits at the severe end of the spectrum, the kind where even the most powerful hearing aids deliver only muffled vibrations that the brain struggles to interpret as language. His mother, Rosalie, had wept when the diagnosis came. His father, Dominic, had said nothing at all. He had simply stood in the hallway of Pennsylvania Hospital, gripping his hat in both hands, staring at the floor tiles until a nurse asked if he needed to sit down. He did not sit down. Dominic Ferrara never sat down when the world was trying to knock him over. Rosalie died 3 years later. A stroke, the official cause said, brought on by an undiagnosed aneurysm. She was 31 years old. At her funeral, Father Brendan McCarthy, the family's personal priest from St. Anthony's in South Philly, said she had been a woman of extraordinary grace. Dominic stood at the graveside in a black coat that cost more than most men earned in a month, and he held Leo's small hand, and Leo looked up at him with wide brown eyes that understood nothing and everything at the same time. After that, Dominic Ferrara loved his son with a ferocity that bordered on madness. He hired the best specialists money could acquire quietly. Not the flashy ENT surgeons at Jefferson or Penn Medicine. Those practices kept records, had residents who gossiped, had students who blogged. No, Dominic used private consultants, men and women who were paid enough to forget they'd ever been in a room with the Ferrara family. He flew a renowned cochlear implant specialist named Dr. Stuart Holt from a private practice in Scottsdale, Arizona, twice a year. Dr. Holt would examine Leo, adjust the family's understanding of the options, collect a retainer that required no invoice, and leave. The answer was always the same. Leo was not a suitable cochlear implant candidate. The specific anatomy of his cochlea, Holt explained carefully, presented complications that made surgical intervention high risk without proportionate reward. The family accepted this. They accepted it because Holt had credentials that filled an entire wall, because his voice carried the calm authority of a man who had operated on the inner ears of Fortune 500 executives, because nobody in the Ferrara organization, not Tony Barone, the underboss, not Angelo Crespi, Dominic's driver and closest confidant, not even the family's lawyer, a man named Gerald Fisk, who had degrees from Georgetown and Penn, had any reason to question a physician of that caliber. Nobody questioned it, because nobody had access to what was really in Leo's medical file, and so Leo drew birds, and he learned to sign with his tutors, and he watched his father's face the way a navigator watches the stars, with total dependence, interpreting everything from the small movements, the tightening jaw, the way the eyes softened when Dominic thought no one was looking. Once, when Leo was 7, he had pressed his small hand flat against the parlor wall while Angelo played a record in the hallway. Old Sinatra, the kind of song that lived in the bones of every man in that house. Leo stood there for 4 minutes, feeling the vibration travel through the plaster and into his palm. When Angelo noticed and moved to stop the music, Dominic said quietly, "Leave it," and the 2 grown men stood in silence while a small deaf boy felt Frank Sinatra move through a wall. That was the kind of man Dominic Ferrara was, beneath all of it. On November 14th, Dominic had a lunch meeting at Caruso's, a small restaurant on Passyunk Avenue that had been operating in the same family since 1971. It was a Tuesday, which was important. Tuesdays at Caruso's were slow. Tuesdays meant fewer civilians in the dining room, fewer chances for photographs, fewer opportunities for the kind of public incident that Detective Roy Castle from the FBI's Organized Crime Task Force would have found professionally satisfying. Dominic arrived at 12:15 with Angelo driving and 2 other men following in a second car. The meeting was with Paul Crisanti, Big Paul, 63 years old, boss of the Crisanti family out of South Jersey, a man who had the physical presence of a retired longshoreman and the negotiating instincts of a shark that had once been a corporate attorney. They were there to discuss territory. Specifically, the stretch of port operations between Wilmington and Marcus Hook, which had become contested in ways that were straining everyone's resources. Dominic had left Leo at home, with his tutors and a promise, communicated in the fluid, expressive sign language they shared together, that he would be back before dinner. Leo had signed back, "Bring me something." It was a game they had. Dominic always brought him something, a drawing pencil from a particular shop, a small carved wooden thing from a market, once an actual live sparrow in a ventilated box that Leo had stared at for a full minute before releasing it through his bedroom window. He would not be back before dinner. The meeting was about to become something else entirely. They were seated in the private back room at Caruso's, a space with burgundy wallpaper and a painting of the Bay of Naples that nobody had looked at in 15 years, when the waitress arrived. She was not the usual girl. Rosa, who normally worked the back room on Tuesdays, had called in sick that morning. The replacement was a woman in her early 30s, dark-haired, wearing the standard black apron over a white shirt that was slightly too large at the shoulders. She moved with the efficiency of someone who had been waiting tables for a long time, not the nervous over-attentiveness of a new employee. She introduced herself without ceremony. "Claire, I'll be taking care of you today." She took the drink orders, sparkling water for Dominic, red wine for Big Paul, coffee all around for the others, and left. Big Paul looked across the table and said in the low register he used for business, "She knew?" Angelo shrugged. "Rosa's out sick." "She's got an interesting face," Big Paul said. It wasn't a comment with an edge to it. It was the observation of a man who had spent decades reading rooms. Dominic wasn't listening. He was reading a message on his phone, something from Leo's primary tutor, a man named David Marsh, who reported that Leo had finished 3 weeks of mathematics curriculum in a single morning and had then asked, in sign, whether birds could dream. Dominic looked at the message for a moment. Then he put his phone away and focused on the meeting. He would think about that message later. He would think about it in the context of everything that was about to happen and wonder if Leo had already known. Somehow, through whatever heightened awareness a child develops when one sense is absent and all the others compensate, that the day was going to turn into something that could not be undone. The lunch went normally for 45 minutes. The port territory was discussed, positions were staked, a rough framework of compromise was assembled with the kind of careful, unchoreographed precision that made the upper echelons of organized crime function less like gangster movies and more like very dangerous corporate board meetings. Big Paul ate the branzino. Dominic had the veal. Nobody raised their voice. Then Leo walked in. Angelo saw him first. He was standing at the front entrance of Caruso's in his school coat, his backpack on both shoulders, looking around the restaurant with an expression of mild curiosity and complete composure. He had his father's dark eyes and his mother's careful stillness. Angelo was on his feet and unbiased before anyone else processed it. He crossed the dining room in 10 seconds and crouched down in front of Leo, signing rapidly. "How did you get here?" "Where is David?" Leo signed back, unhurried. "David got a phone call and went to his car. I got the address from your jacket last week. I took the bus." Angelo closed his eyes briefly. He had left a business card for Caruso's in his jacket pocket 3 weeks ago. Leo had seen it and memorized it. Of course he had. He signed. "Your father is in a meeting." Leo signed. "I know. I'll wait." There was no arguing with this. Angelo knew it. He brought Leo to a small table at the edge of the main dining room, near the window, where he could be watched from the hallway that led to the private room. He ordered Leo a Coke and a plate of bread, and went back to explain the situation to Dominic, who received the news with the particular expression of a man who is managing violent professional annoyance and profound parental relief simultaneously. 5 minutes, Dominic said. He wrapped up the essentials with Big Paul, made his apologies, and stepped out to the main dining room. Leo saw him coming and stood up, and Dominic crossed to him and put both hands briefly on the boy's shoulders, a gesture that, in their private language, meant, "You're okay, I see you, everything is fine." Then he signed, "You scared Angelo half to death." Leo grinned. It transformed his whole face, that grin. Rosalie's grin, borrowed and living on. He signed, "Good, he moves too slow." Dominic sat across from his son. Big Paul was getting his coat, preparing to leave graciously, as men in his position did when domestic complications arose, with perfect understanding and absolutely zero sentimentality. Angelo was standing near the door. The other 2 men were in the car outside. Claire, the replacement waitress, appeared with a coffee refill she hadn't been asked for and set it down without comment. She was moving to leave when she stopped. She stopped because she was looking at Leo, not the way people looked at Leo. Not with that particular species of pity that strangers sometimes couldn't suppress when they saw the boy signing, when they registered his deafness and responded with faces that Leo had learned to read and ignore with great efficiency. This was different. She was looking at him the way someone looks at a face they recognize from a photograph, from a file, from a dream they've been waiting to have for a long time. Dominic noticed. He had spent 30 years noticing things that most people missed. "Something wrong," he said. Claire met his eyes. She had the steadiest eyes he'd seen in a long time. "No," she said. "I'm sorry." And she moved to leave. Leo was watching her. He couldn't hear the exchange, but he was watching her face with the same focused attention he gave to everything. Total, unfiltered, unself-conscious study. And then he did something that made every man in Dominic Ferrara's orbit go very still. He raised his hand and signed at her. "Hello. Do you understand me?" It was a greeting he gave to everyone he wasn't sure about. A test of sorts, casual and hopeful, like a child holding a door open to see if an animal will come inside. Claire Novak stood completely still for 1 second, and then she signed back. "Yes, I understand you." The dining room had the particular quality of silence that precedes something irreversible. Dominic was on his feet without realizing he'd stood up. Angelo had moved 2 steps closer from his position near the entrance. Big Paul, who had been buttoning his coat near the hostess stand, had stopped buttoning. Claire's signing was fluent, not the careful, slightly labored signing of someone who had taken a community class or learned from a YouTube tutorial. This was the signing of someone who had spent years in rooms with deaf patients, who had learned the language not as an academic exercise, but as a professional necessity, as a form of care. Her hands shaped the words with the unself-consciousness of a person who has forgotten they are doing something unusual. Leo's face had opened like a window being thrown wide. He signed back immediately, rapidly, with the barely contained energy of a child who has been handed an unexpected gift. "You sign really well. Are you a teacher?" Claire looked at Dominic. There was something in her expression, not fear exactly, but the awareness of standing at the edge of something. "I used to work with children," she said aloud for the adults in the room, "with deaf children. I was a pediatric audiologist." The word landed in the room like a stone in still water. Dominic's face had gone to the expression his men called marble. Total stillness, total control, nothing given away. But his hands, gripping the back of the chair, were white at the knuckles. "Used to be," he said. "I lost my license," Claire said. 4 years ago. A beat. "Why?" Dominic asked. His voice was perfectly level. "A malpractice case," she said. "That I didn't cause. But the complaint was filed and the board found against me, and by the time the appeals process was exhausted, my career was over." She paused. "I've been waitressing since." Big Paul excused himself with a brief nod to Dominic that said clearly, "This is yours, whatever it is." He left with his 2 men. The door closed behind him. Angelo took up a position near the entrance. The restaurant had emptied of its few other Tuesday lunch patrons. The owner, Sal Caruso, 71 years old, arthritic hands, a man who had been serving the Ferrara family since Dominic's father was alive, retreated to the kitchen without being asked. Dominic looked at this woman, this waitress, this former audiologist with her ink-stained fingers and her steady eyes, and he understood, with the particular intuition of a man who has survived by reading situations accurately, that she had not walked into Caruso's by accident. "Sit down," he said. It wasn't a request. Claire sat. Leo was watching everything, reading the room the way he always did, his eyes moving between faces with the practiced skill of someone who has learned that expression is its own language and that adults almost always say more with their faces than their mouths. He signed to Claire. "Are you in trouble?" Claire looked at him. Something shifted in her face. Something that had been held back for a long time, something that had weight to it. She signed back. "No, I came to help you." Then she reached into the front pocket of her apron. Dominic's hand moved, an instinct, a reflex, and Angelo was suddenly 3 feet closer, one hand inside his jacket. Claire moved slowly, deliberately, the way a person moves when they understand that the room is armed and that speed will be misinterpreted as threat. She withdrew a folded envelope, white, unmarked, and set it flat on the table between herself and Dominic. "I've been looking for the right moment to find you," she said. "For 2 years. I didn't know how to approach you. I didn't know if I'd be believed or if I'd—" She stopped. "I didn't know if I'd be safe." Dominic looked at the envelope. He did not touch it. "What's in there?" he said. "Leo's real medical records," she said. "The ones Dr. Stuart Holt has been hiding from you for 11 years. The silence in Caruso's back hallway was the kind that fills a room when something ordinary becomes catastrophic, when the before and the after split apart like a fault line, and everyone present knows that nothing is going to go back to the way it was. Dominic picked up the envelope. Inside were 8 pages. They were photocopies, but clear ones. Clinical documentation, the kind with headers and patient ID numbers and the particular formatting of official medical records. Leo Ferrara's name appeared at the top of the first page, with a date of birth Dominic knew by heart. The evaluating clinician's name, on the original assessment at the bottom of the page, was C. Novak, Audi, CCCA, Claire Novak, Doctor of Audiology. She had been the audiologist who first evaluated Leo, not Dr. Holt, Claire. Dominic looked up from the page. "You were there at the beginning," he said. "I was the one who did Leo's initial audiological evaluation when he was 6 weeks old," Claire said. "Pennsylvania Hospital. I was part of the newborn hearing screening program. Leo failed his initial screening, and I was assigned to do his full diagnostic evaluation. She paused. He has severe bilateral sensorineural hearing loss. That part of what you were told is true. But, Dominic said, but Leo is an excellent cochlear implant candidate, Claire said. Has been since he was approximately 18 months old. The window for ideal language development outcomes for a child who receives a cochlear implant early enough is between 12 and 18 months. You can still get meaningful results later. Many people do. It's harder. The language pathways are less plastic, but with intensive therapy and a strong support system. She stopped herself. He should have been implanted years ago, Mr. Ferrara. There is no anatomical complication. I saw his imaging. The cochlea is normal. Holt lied to you. The papers in Dominic's hands made a faint sound as his grip tightened. Why? He said. His voice was very quiet. Because someone paid him to, Claire said. Dominic set the papers down with great care. He looked at Angelo, who looked back with an expression that said he was hearing everything and filing everything, and would follow whatever came next without question. Who? Dominic said. Claire took a breath. This was the part she had rehearsed the most, lying awake in the rented room above a laundromat in Kensington, where she'd been living for 8 months. This was the part where a woman who had spent 4 years being afraid looked at the man everyone in 3 states feared and said the name anyway. Tony Barone, she said. The room went so still that the traffic sound from Passyunk Avenue seemed to come from another world. Tony Barone, Dominic's underboss, the man who had been at Dominic's side for 22 years, who had been the best man at his wedding to Rosalie, who had held Leo at his christening and made a sign of the cross over his small, sleeping head. You're sure? Dominic said. It was not a question. It was what a man says when he already knows the answer and is giving himself 1 more second before it becomes real. The malpractice complaint against me was filed by a woman named Diane Coates, Claire said, and she claimed I had missed an infection that caused her son's hearing damage. I hadn't. Her son had a different audiologist entirely. I'd never met her son. But the paperwork placed me in the case, and the complaint was detailed enough that the board opened an investigation. She pulled a second, smaller envelope from her apron pocket. She had come prepared, methodically, like someone who had planned this for a very long time. Diane Coates is Tony Barone's cousin, on his mother's side. I didn't know that until 8 months ago, when I started looking. She put that envelope on the table, too. She filed the complaint to remove me from the picture, Claire said, because I was the one who had done Leo's original evaluation. Because I had copies of his real records. Because I had written a letter. This is in there, to Dr. Holt, 14 months after Leo's diagnosis, asking why cochlear implantation hadn't been discussed with the family. Holt never responded. 2 weeks later, the complaint appeared. Dominic stared at the envelope. Leo was still watching everything. He couldn't hear the conversation, but he was reading his father's face with the sharp attention of a child who has been doing this his entire life, and what he was reading there frightened him in a way he couldn't yet name. He reached across the table and touched his father's hand. Dominic looked at his son. Leo signed. What's happening? Dominic looked at his boy for a long moment. Then he looked at Claire. Tell me, he said quietly, why Barone would do this. Claire had not known the answer to this question when she first began pulling at the thread 4 years ago, still stunned and grieving over the loss of the career she had spent a decade building. She had not known it 2 years ago, when she finally connected Diane Coates to Tony Barone, and understood that her professional destruction had been deliberate. She had arrived at the answer only slowly, through the accumulation of small details that began to form a shape she recognized with horrible clarity. She explained it carefully. She explained it the way she had learned to do during 2 years of rehearsal, stripping away the emotional charge and presenting it like a case file, like the clinical documentation she was trained to produce, because she understood that this was the only version of the truth that a man like Dominic Ferrara would receive without shutting down. It started with Rosalie. Rosalie Ferrara had been 21 years old when she married Dominic, and she had been, by every account, a woman of exceptional intelligence who had been underestimated her entire short life. She had grown up in South Philly, the daughter of a man who ran a small but respected lending operation, legitimate on the surface, careful in its arrangements. She had met Dominic at a 4th of July gathering on her cousin's roof, and they had been inseparable within 6 weeks. What Dominic did not know, what almost no one knew, was that Rosalie, in the months before Leo's birth, had become suspicious of something. "She came to me," Claire said. Dominic went absolutely still. "She came to your prenatal audiologist," Angelo said from across the room. He couldn't help it. "She came to the hospital where I was working," Claire said, "not as a patient, informally. She had been referred to me through a mutual contact, a nurse I worked with who knew someone who knew Rosalie. She came to me because she had heard I was trustworthy. She came to me because she was afraid to talk to anyone inside her own world." She paused, choosing the words. Rosalie had found evidence that someone close to her husband had been deliberately exposing her to something during her pregnancy, Claire said. She didn't have the clinical vocabulary for it, but what she described was consistent with in utero ototoxic exposure, certain medications, certain chemicals, administered in doses low enough to go undetected in standard prenatal blood work, but significant enough, over time, to affect fetal cochlear development. The silence in the room had taken on a new quality. It was the silence of a man who is very careful in not reacting to something, because if he reacts, he won't be able to stop. "She was poisoned," Dominic said, flat, declarative. "She was exposed to something that I believe was intended to cause exactly what it caused," Claire said. "I can't tell you what it was. I'm not a toxicologist. But I put her in contact with a physician colleague of mine who agreed to run a non-standard panel, quietly. The results were not conclusive, but they were not normal." "What happened to those results?" Dominic said. "Rosalie took them," Claire said. "She said she needed time to think. She said she wasn't sure what she was going to do with them. She came to see me one more time, 3 months after Leo was born, to ask about his hearing test results. She was—" Claire stopped. She was very composed, the kind of composed that means someone has made peace with something terrible. She died 9 months after that visit. Stroke, undiagnosed aneurysm, 31 years old. Dominic stood up. He walked to the other side of the room and stood with his back to everyone for a moment, looking at the painting of the Bay of Naples that nobody had looked at in 15 years. His hands were clasped behind his back. The knuckles were white. Nobody spoke. When he turned around, his face had gone back to marble. But his eyes were different. The eyes were the eyes of a man standing inside a grief he had never fully allowed himself to feel, because he had a son to protect and an empire to run, and emotions were a luxury he had convinced himself he could not afford. "Why Barone?" he said. "Tell me the why." Claire looked at him steadily. Tony Barone wanted the Ferrara operation to pass to someone he could control, she said. He'd spent 22 years in the number 2 position. He wasn't interested in waiting. Dominic Ferrara's son was his path, if that son was compromised. Dependent, isolated from the world by a disability that had been engineered and then managed. A deaf boy who would one day inherit an empire would need someone to translate the world for him. Barone intended to be that person. She paused. He needed Leo to never hear, she said, not because of cruelty, but because of strategy. A deaf Ferrara heir was leverage, an heir who received a cochlear implant, who could hear, who could engage with the world directly without interpretation or intermediary. That heir was a threat to Barone's long game. Dominic sat back down very slowly. Leo was watching his father's face. Something had changed in the room that he could feel in the same way he felt music through walls. A vibration beneath the surface, something fundamental and load-bearing, shifting. He reached out and touched his father's arm. Dominic looked at his son. He looked at him for a long time. Then he looked at Claire Novak. "Can he still get the implant?" he said. His voice, for the first time in the conversation, had something underneath it. Something breakable. "He's 11, Claire said. "The ideal window has passed, but outcomes at this age, with the right surgical team and intensive post-implant therapy, can still be meaningful. He won't wake up from surgery hearing the way you do. It's not a cure, and it's not a miracle. It's a process, and it's hard work, and it will take time. But yes." She met his eyes. "He can get the implant." A pause. "I came here," she said quietly, "because I spent 4 years thinking about that boy. I lost my career because of what someone didn't want him to have. I wasn't willing to let it stay that way." What followed happened in 2 simultaneous movements, the private and the institutional, unfolding across the next 72 hours with a speed and decisiveness that those who would later know the story would recognize as the particular operational efficiency of a man who had spent his adult life solving problems that could not be solved by ordinary means. The first movement was internal. Tony Barone was brought to a meeting at a location that would not be mentioned in any official record. He came expecting a conversation about the port territory. Dominic had messaged him that afternoon with the summary of the Big Paul lunch, framed normally, precisely. Barone arrived with no particular alarm, because 22 years of trust had made him confident in a way that had quietly become its own vulnerability. What he found was Dominic alone at a table, the documentation spread out flat in front of him, with the careful arrangement of a man who has prepared this presentation with complete intentionality. What Barone said, confronted with it, his denials, his maneuvering, the particular species of lies a man tells when he has been completely caught and is still trying to find a way out through the sheer momentum of his own confidence, is not worth repeating in detail. It follows a pattern that anyone who has ever seen a powerful person cornered will recognize. First, there is the blanket denial. Then there is the attempt at alternative explanation. Then there is the pivot to the question of source and reliability. And then, when all of that fails, there is the silence that is its own confession. Dominic listened to all of it without expression. When Barone finished, Dominic looked at him for a long moment and said, "You were at his christening." Barone said nothing. "You held him," Dominic said. "You made the sign of the cross over him. Father Brendan asked you to be his godfather, and you said yes." The silence between them had the quality of something irreversible. "Get out of my city," Dominic said. "Get out tonight. If you're here tomorrow morning, the documentation goes to Detective Roy Cassell at the FBI with an anonymous note about Rosalie's medical records and your cousin Diane Coates and Dr. Stuart Holt in Scottsdale." He paused. "I know what Cassell has been building. I know how long he's been building it. What I'm giving you is a head start, not forgiveness. There is no forgiveness. Get out." Tony Barone, who had spent 22 years in the number 2 position of one of the most powerful criminal organizations on the eastern seaboard, left Philadelphia that night with a single bag. He was in Miami by morning. He never came back. The second movement was for Leo. Dominic called David Marsh, the tutor, and told him the situation in broad outline, without the organizational details, only what was medically relevant. He asked Marsh, who had a network of contacts in the educational and medical support community for deaf children, to help identify the best available surgical team in the Northeast. Marsh gave him 3 names within 6 hours. One of them was a pediatric cochlear implant specialist at Children's Hospital of Philadelphia, a surgeon named Dr. Patricia Wren, who had performed over 300 implantation procedures and whose outcomes data, available in the public medical literature, was exceptional. He called Claire Novak next. She was still at Caruso's. Sal had closed the restaurant for the afternoon and brought her tea in the kitchen and sat with her without speaking, because Sal Caruso was 71 years old and had seen enough to know when a person needed to be quietly accompanied rather than questioned. "I want you to be involved," Dominic said when she answered, "in whatever capacity makes sense. As a consultant, an advocate, whatever the right word is, I want you in the room when we talk to the surgical team." A pause. "I don't have my license," Claire said. "I have lawyers who specialize in appeals," Dominic said. "Gerald Fisk has contacts at the State Medical Board that I have not previously used. I intend to use them now." Another pause. "That malpractice complaint was false. There's documentation of that in what you gave me. If you're willing, I'd like to help you get your license back." A longer pause. "Why?" Claire said. "Because Leo is going to need an audiologist he can trust," Dominic said. "And because you came to Caruso's on a Tuesday with a white envelope in your apron pocket when you didn't have to, when it wasn't safe, when you had nothing to gain." He stopped. "My wife trusted you. I think that means something." Claire was quiet for a moment. "Yes," she said. "I'll be involved." The surgery was scheduled for January 8th at Children's Hospital of Philadelphia. Dr. Patricia Wren, who was 54 years old and had the particular calm of a person who has done difficult things so many times that difficulty has become simply the terrain of her daily life, met with Dominic and Leo together. She was one of the few people outside the family's inner circle who had ever been brought into direct conversation with both of them, and she handled it with a naturalness that Dominic recognized as genuine rather than performed. She spoke directly to Leo, using a combination of sign and written notes on a small whiteboard, explaining what would happen and what it would not be. Leo listened with the same focused, unself-conscious attention he gave everything. At the end, he asked her, in sign, with Claire interpreting, whether it would hurt. Dr. Wren wrote on the whiteboard, "A little after, but the nurses will take good care of you, and your dad will be there." Leo looked at Dominic. Then he looked back at Dr. Wren and signed, "Okay." The surgery lasted 4 hours. Dominic sat in the waiting room the entire time, with Angelo beside him and Claire on the other side, the three of them barely speaking. Father Brendan came and sat for an hour in the middle, saying a rosary quietly, and Dominic, who had not prayed in 20 years, did not stop him. When Dr. Wren came out, she was smiling in the restrained, professional way that experienced surgeons smile when things have gone exactly as hoped. "He did beautifully," she said. "Everything was where it should be. The device is in place. The activation, the moment when the audiologist's equipment sends the first signal through the implant and the brain begins to receive sound for the first time, doesn't happen immediately after surgery. The healing has to happen first. There is a process, a waiting period, an act of patience that is its own particular kind of faith." Leo came home to the estate in Chester County 3 days after surgery, with a bandage behind his ear and the slightly dazed, slightly exhilarated expression of someone who has been through something large and is still processing its dimensions. Angelo carried his bag inside. David Marsh was waiting with a meal and the latest sketchbook Leo had left behind, open to a half-finished drawing of a barn owl. Leo sat at the kitchen table and finished the owl's wings, while Dominic sat across from him and watched. That night, Leo signed to his father. "Will it work?" Dominic signed back, "We don't know yet, but we'll find out together." Leo considered this. Then he signed, "I'm not scared." Dominic signed, "I know. You never are." A pause. Leo looked at the table, then back up. "You are, though," he signed. "I can tell." Dominic looked at his son for a long time. "Yes," he signed, "I am." It was the most honest thing he had said to anyone in years. The activation was scheduled for 4 weeks post-surgery. It took place in a small clinical room at Claire Novak's temporary workspace, a consulting arrangement she had negotiated with a private practice in Center City, while her license appeal moved through the State Medical Board, which was progressing with an unusual degree of efficiency that may or may not have been related to a series of quiet conversations Gerald Fisk had conducted with several board members over the preceding weeks. The room had a chair for Leo, a chair for Dominic beside him, and Claire's equipment arranged on the table: the programming software, the external processor, the components of a technology that had existed for decades and had been withheld from this boy for 11 years by a man who was currently living in a 2-bedroom apartment in Brickell, Miami, having quietly abandoned any claim to his former life. Claire talked Leo through what she was about to do, signing clearly and calmly. She explained that the first sounds might be strange, overwhelming, nothing like he might imagine. That brains accustomed to silence have to learn to interpret sound the way a person has to learn to interpret a new language, and that the process would take time and work and patience. Leo nodded. He was sitting very straight in the chair. He had drawn a picture that morning of a bird in mid-song, its beak open, its throat working, a bird making a sound Leo had never heard, and he had left it folded in his jacket pocket. Dominic knew it was there. Leo had shown him before they left the house. Claire made the final adjustments. She looked at Leo and signed. "Ready?" Leo signed. "Ready." She activated the device. What happened in the next 60 seconds was something that Dominic Ferrara would spend the rest of his life trying and failing to describe to anyone who hadn't been in the room. He would attempt it once, for Father Brendan, late on a winter evening at St. Anthony's, sitting in a back pew. Not quite praying, but not quite not praying either. And he would get as far as his face changed before something in his throat closed and he had to stop. The sounds initially were too much. Claire had prepared for this. She adjusted the mapping, brought the levels down, created a gentler entry point for a brain encountering stimulus it had never processed. Leo's eyes were wide, and his breathing had changed. Not frightened, but enormous, the breathing of someone standing at the edge of something so vast they haven't yet found the edge of it. He turned his head. Angelo, standing just outside the open door in the hallway, had shifted his weight, and his shoe had made a small sound against the floor. Leo turned his head towards that sound. He hadn't done it consciously. It was reflex, the automatic, evolutionary reflex of a living creature locating a source of sound. He had turned his head toward a sound he heard, without thinking, the way any of them would. Dominic made a sound he hadn't planned to make, something short and involuntary, something that came from a place below language. Leo turned towards that sound too. He looked at his father, who was crying, not quietly, not with any of the composure that had characterized every public moment of the man's adult life, just plainly, openly, with the ungainly realness of a person who has been holding something for 11 years and can no longer hold it. Leo watched his father's face. He reached out and touched his cheek, the way a child does, wondering, not embarrassed, just interested in this new information about the person he knew better than anyone. Then, slowly, with the uncertain self-consciousness of someone doing something for the very first time, Leo opened his mouth. He had speech therapy scheduled, months of it, beginning the following week. He knew, Claire had explained it in their consultations, that speaking would be its own long process, that his voice would need training and time and enormous patience, that this was not a movie where someone hears for the first time and immediately speaks in perfect sentences. What came out of his mouth was not a word. It was a sound, vowel-adjacent, the kind of first vocal experiment that a child makes before language has given it form. It was imprecise and uncertain and completely extraordinary. Dominic gripped his son's hand. Leo made the sound again. He was listening to himself. His face was doing something it had never done before, the specific awed expression of a person hearing their own voice for the first time, discovering that they are not silent inside. Claire, who had activated hundreds of cochlear implants in her career, and who had thought she was fully prepared for the emotional dimensions of this particular activation, was pressing her hand flat against her mouth and not quite managing the professional composure she had intended to maintain. Angelo, in the hallway, had turned to face the wall. Leo looked at Claire. He looked at his father. He looked around the room as though he was seeing it for the first time, which in a sense he was. It was the same room, but it was a room with sound in it now, with dimensionality, with the hum of the building's climate system, and the faint traffic outside, and the breathing of the people around him. He looked at his father for a long time. Then he raised his hands and signed, because this was still the language he knew, the language his hands had been speaking since before he could remember, the language that had been the whole world between them for 11 years. He signed, "I can hear you." Dominic signed back, hands not entirely steady. "I know." Leo signed, "I could hear you before, too. Just differently." Dominic looked at his son. Leo signed, "It's okay, Dad. I'm the same." Dominic Ferrara, who had built an empire on the principle that he was harder and colder and more controlled than every other man in the room, who had never once, in 30 years, shown weakness in front of anyone who was not Rosalie, pulled his 11-year-old son into his arms and held on. Leo held on back, with the particular fierceness of a child who has never once doubted that he was loved, but who is nonetheless glad to be held. The license appeal for Claire Novak was resolved 14 weeks later in her favor. The State Medical Board's findings cited newly discovered evidence that the original malpractice complaint had been filed by a party with a demonstrated conflict of interest and no legitimate standing. Her full audiological certification was restored. She accepted a position at Children's Hospital of Philadelphia, where Dr. Patricia Wren had quietly advocated for her, working specifically with pediatric cochlear implant patients and their families. Dr. Stuart Holt in Scottsdale received approximately 3 weeks after the activation a brief, unannounced visit from 2 men he had never met before. No violence occurred. What occurred was a conversation, and the handing over of a document, and an explanation of exactly what would happen if any variation of the fabricated medical record he had been providing the Ferrara family ever surfaced anywhere again. Holt retired from private practice shortly afterward, citing personal health concerns. Detective Roy Cassell of the FBI's Organized Crime Task Force continued his investigation of the Ferrara organization. It continued to be, as it had been for the preceding 8 years, a thorough and professionally conducted investigation that had not yet produced charges. These things take time. Leo Ferrara began intensive speech therapy in February. By March, he could identify environmental sounds with remarkable consistency. By April, his speech therapist, a woman named Barbara Osei, who had been working with pediatric hearing patients for 27 years, told Dominic privately that Leo was one of the most motivated patients she had ever worked with. "He practices constantly," she said. "He records himself and plays it back and then tries again. He's completely unintimidated by the difficulty of it. That's his mother in him," Dominic said. He still signed with Leo at home. He intended to always sign with Leo at home, the language they had built together over 11 years, the private, complete, elaborated system of communication that had been their whole relationship, was not something he had any interest in trading in. It was theirs. It would always be theirs. On an evening in May, Leo came to find Dominic in the study, where Dominic was sitting at his desk reading something that required attention. Leo didn't knock. He never knocked. He couldn't hear his own knocks. But Dominic always knew he was there, the way you always know when someone who matters to you has entered a room. Leo sat across from his father. He had his sketchbook. He turned it to show Dominic the page. It was a drawing of a woman with dark hair and steady eyes, standing at a restaurant table with a white envelope in her hand. The likeness was unmistakable. Below it, in Leo's careful, developing handwriting, because he was also learning to speak on paper, learning to translate his thoughts into the written form of a language he was only now beginning to hear. He had written 3 words. She saved me. Dominic looked at the drawing for a long time. Then he looked at his son. She saved us both, he said. Leo heard it. He heard every word. His face showed it. The slight adjustment, the intake of breath, the recognition that is still new enough to be visible on his face even now. The awareness of sound as gift rather than given. He nodded. Then he took back his sketchbook and began adding detail to the drawing. The precise folds of the apron, the ink stain on the fingers, the particular angle of the eyes that looked at a boy in a restaurant and recognized something that everyone else had been paid to overlook. Outside, the Chester County spring was doing what spring does, insisting on itself against all the grey evidence of the preceding months, pushing through ground that had seemed too cold and too hard to allow anything to grow. Leo drew, and Dominic watched, and somewhere across the city, in an office at Children's Hospital of Philadelphia, Claire Novak was sitting with a family she had never met before, explaining to them, gently and clearly, and without rushing, that the road ahead was long, and the work was real, and the outcome was not guaranteed, but that their child was going to be heard. There are stories that remind you what loyalty really costs, and what silence can be weaponized into, and what a single act of courage from someone with nothing to gain can undo in the life of a child who never asked to be caught in the middle of someone else's ambition. Dominic Ferrara built a world of power by making people afraid. But the thing that saved his son wasn't power. It was a woman with ink-stained hands and a white envelope, and the kind of stubborn moral clarity that the world keeps trying to exhaust out of people, and sometimes fails. If this story hit you somewhere real, if it made you feel the weight of what children carry when adults around them choose strategy over love, share it. Someone you know needs to hear this today. Like this video, leave a comment about the moment that got you, and subscribe because the stories we tell next are just as true, just as human, and just as worth your time. Don't let the algorithm bury what matters. Pass it on.